When we think of the Middle Ages, our minds often drift to grand castles, armored knights, and royal courts filled with intrigue. But the vast majority of medieval people never set foot in a castle. They lived in villages, small clusters of thatched-roof cottages surrounded by fields, forests, and the rhythms of agricultural life. Today, we're stepping away from kings and battles to explore something far more common, yet rarely discussed. What was daily life actually like for an ordinary villager in medieval Europe? The medieval village was home to perhaps a few dozen families, sometimes more, sometimes fewer. These weren't isolated homesteads scattered across the landscape. Instead, houses clustered together near a church, a well, and often a manor house belonging to the local lord. This arrangement wasn't accidental. It reflected the fundamental truth of medieval rural life. Survival depended on cooperation. Most villagers were peasants, and the majority of those were serfs. A serf wasn't exactly a slave, but they weren't free either. They were bound to the land they worked. They couldn't leave without their lord's permission, couldn't marry someone from another village without paying a fee, and owed a portion of everything they produced to the manor. In exchange, they had the right to farm their strips of land and received protection from the lord in times of danger. The village day began at dawn. There were no clocks in peasant homes, so the church bells marked the passage of time, calling people to prayer and signaling the start and end of work. Breakfast was simple, often just bread and weak ale. Then came the work, and there was always work to be done. The agricultural calendar dictated everything. In spring, villagers prepared the fields and planted crops. Summer meant constant maintenance, weeding, and watching over growing grain. Autumn brought the harvest, the most critical time of year. A good harvest meant survival through winter. A poor one meant hunger, or worse. Winter offered some respite from fieldwork, but brought its own labors, repairing tools, tending to animals, and simply staying warm. Farming wasn't done on private plots as we know them today. Most medieval villages used the open field system. The arable land around the village was divided into 2 or 3 enormous fields, and each family held scattered strips within these fields. One field might lie fallow each year to recover its fertility, while the others were planted with crops like wheat, barley, rye, or oats. This rotation helped maintain soil health across generations. Beyond the fields lay common lands, meadows for grazing livestock, forests for gathering firewood and foraging, and streams for fishing. Access to these commons was essential. A peasant family might own a cow, a few pigs, some chickens, and perhaps a goat. These animals provided milk, eggs, and eventually meat, but keeping them alive through winter was a constant challenge. Fodder was precious, and many animals were slaughtered in autumn simply because there wasn't enough food to sustain them until spring. The peasant home itself was modest by any standard. Most houses had just 1 or 2 rooms with walls of wattle and daub, essentially woven sticks covered with a mixture of mud, straw, and animal dung. Roofs were thatched with straw or reeds. There was no chimney in most homes. Smoke from the central hearth simply rose and filtered out through the roof. Furniture was minimal, perhaps a table, a few stools, and straw-filled mattresses for sleeping. The entire family often shared a single room, and during the coldest months, livestock might be brought inside to share their body heat. Food was simple and repetitive. Bread was the staple, consumed at every meal. Peasants rarely ate fine white bread. Their loaves were dark and coarse, made from whatever grain was available. Pottage, a thick stew of vegetables, grains, and occasionally bits of meat, was the other dietary cornerstone. Fresh meat was a luxury reserved for special occasions. Preserved fish, especially herring, provided protein during Lent and other fasting periods mandated by the church. Speaking of the church, religion permeated every aspect of village life. The parish church stood at the heart of the community, both physically and spiritually. Villagers attended Mass regularly, observed dozens of holy days throughout the year, and marked every significant life event, from baptism to burial, within its walls. The local priest was one of the few literate people in the village, and often served as advisor, mediator, and record-keeper. Holy days weren't just religious obligations, they were holidays in the truest sense. On these days, work stopped. Villagers gathered for feasts, games, and celebrations. Christmas, Easter, and the feast day of the village's patron saint brought the community together in ways that broke the monotony of agricultural labor. These celebrations featured music, dancing, wrestling matches, and plenty of ale. Village society had its own hierarchy. At the top sat the lord of the manor, or his representative. Below him came the priest, the miller, and the blacksmith, skilled individuals whose services everyone needed. Then came the various ranks of peasants themselves, free tenants who owed rent but not labor service, and serfs who owed both. At the bottom were the landless laborers who worked for others and owned nothing but their own labor. The manor court handled disputes, punished minor crimes, and enforced the countless rules that governed village life. When could you graze your animals on the stubble after harvest? How much could the miller charge for grinding grain? What happened if your pig escaped and damaged a neighbor's garden? These questions, and hundreds like them, were settled in the manor court, with the lord or his steward presiding and villagers serving as jury. Women's lives followed their own patterns. A peasant woman worked just as hard as her husband, often harder. She managed the household, prepared food, brewed ale, tended the garden, cared for children, and still helped in the fields during busy seasons. Childbirth was dangerous, and many women died young. Those who survived often outlived multiple husbands and managed households well into old age. Children entered the adult world early. By age 7 or 8, they were expected to contribute meaningfully to the family's work. Boys learned farming from their fathers. Girls learned domestic skills from their mothers. Formal education was rare and reserved almost exclusively for boys destined for the church. Life expectancy was short by modern standards, perhaps 40 years if you survived childhood. Disease swept through villages periodically, and medical care was primitive at best. The Black Death of the 14th century killed perhaps a third of Europe's population, devastating villages and transforming the social order in ways that took generations to fully unfold. Yet despite the hardships, medieval villagers found joy in their lives. They celebrated weddings with days of feasting, told stories around winter fires, sang songs while working in the fields, and formed bonds with neighbors that lasted lifetimes. Their world was small, bounded by the fields they worked and the church where they worshipped. But within that world, they built communities, raised families, and created the foundations upon which later generations would build. The medieval village was not a romantic place. It was a world of hard labor, limited horizons, and constant uncertainty. But it was also a world of deep community, shared purpose, and resilient humanity. When we look past the castles and cathedrals to these humble settlements, we find the true story of the Middle Ages. Not the drama of kings and crusades, but the quiet persistence of ordinary people living ordinary lives in extraordinary times.